A Palestinian solidarity group in Britain has accused the UK government of potential complicity in acts of genocide by Israel in Gaza. The report from the British Palestine Committee outlines the UK's relationship with Israel since the war in Gaza began. Willem Marx has more from London.
As Palestinians return to little more than rubble in northern Gaza, Israeli forces that flattened their homes and killed thousands of civilians have, so far, faced few legal consequences. It's been a year since the International Court of Justice ruled that allegations of genocidal Israeli acts inside Gaza were plausible. And since then, the UN's warned Israel's been at risk of carrying out atrocities, while humanitarian groups demanded an end to international military support for Israel. Among the few countries that still defend what Israel calls its right to self-defense in Gaza, the United States remains its biggest backer. But Britain and its military have maintained strong support too, according to the British Palestinian Committee's report released on Tuesday. And that's continued despite widespread popular support in the UK for an end to arms exports to Israel. British firms, for instance, have helped equip F-35 jets that Israel's purchased. The UK government's allowed an airbase in Cyprus to host arms shipment flights to Israel. And at a time when airdrops like these were a relatively rare sight in the skies above Gaza, British aircraft flew hundreds of surveillance flights. Britain, unlike the US, is signed up to the international courts, and such supportive actions could make it complicit in genocide, argue the report's authors.
There should be sanctions, there should be international consequences and legal consequences for individual officials and ministers who may be implicated in this.
Since the early days of Israeli attacks in Gaza, its military actions have prompted British leaders to acknowledge the UK's legal concerns, including David Cameron, Britain's former Prime Minister, who returned to government as Foreign Secretary.
Am I worried that Israel has taken action that might be in breach of international law because this particular premises has been bombed or whatever? Yes, of course I'm worried about that.
Months later, the risks of British involvement in a breach of humanitarian law were sufficiently high that his successor, under a new Labour government, David Lammy, suspended a small fraction of British arms exports to Israel.
There does exist a clear risk that they might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation.
Critics say Britain's policy towards Israel has barely changed since Labour took power from the Conservatives last summer. In response to this latest report, the UK Ministry of Defence said it continued to support Israel's right to security and called on both sides to implement a ceasefire deal that could lead to lasting peace for both Israelis and Palestinians. Willem Marx, Al Jazeera, London.
Sam Perlo-Freeman is a research coordinator at Campaign Against the Arms Trade and fellow at World Peace Foundation. He's joining us now from London. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. I was listening through to Willem's report there. One of the key elements something that at least stood out to me was that although the report itself seems pretty damning, the language that is using is still vague enough to only suggest that the UK may have been taking part in this and maybe complicit in genocide, not actually establishing that proof that that did happen. How difficult would that make it in terms of bringing any sort of action against ministers or anybody else who might be accused of this?
Well, of course, if you're looking at criminal responsibility, it's a very high evidential bar. But I think that, as you say, the evidence presented in this report is damning. There's the arms sales, of which the F-35 components are the most significant. Israel is using these daily at far higher than normal rate of operations, or they were when the war was active, to bomb Gaza. They are linked to very specific atrocities, such as the killing of 90 people in Al-Mawasi in July last year. They absolutely depend on UK components, which form 15% of every F-35 fighter jet. And the Labour government, despite admitting the risk that they can be used in violations of international law, is allowing those F-35 component exports to continue, so long as they go via the US or another partner country. So that is a very clear link. Then there are the other aspects, the logistics flights, the flights of military cargo planes, UK and US, from the military bases in Cyprus to Israel. We don't know what was on those flights, but there is at the very least a very strong likelihood that they contained military supplies. Of course, for any legal criminal case against those responsible, one would need more definite information on what those flights contained, which of course the government is refusing to provide. They are unsurprisingly being very secretive about that. There is surveillance flights.
Forgive me for interrupting you. I want to pick you up
Yeah.
on something that Willem mentioned in his package, that under the new Labour government, David Lammy, they then suspended, he was the UK Foreign Secretary at the time, he suspended a small fraction of British arms exports to Israel, saying there was, quote, a clear risk they might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation. In terms of any subsequent case that's being brought against the British government, does that to some degree acknowledge some sort of involvement, as you've been describing, in the events that you were talking about? Or could the British government actually use that as a way of defending its actions and saying, well, you know, we were aware that this could possibly be happening and therefore we did this and therefore we're fine?
It could absolutely be used. David Lammy, the government has admitted there's a clear risk of equipment being used to violate international humanitarian law. They have concluded that Israel is not following international law in Gaza. That's a huge omission. They've suspended some licenses that they say for equipment that will be used in Gaza. But the previous government and its ministers are certainly responsible for allowing those exports to continue. And most damningly for the current government, they're still, as I say, allowing the F-35 exports. They're not saying that they're allowing them because there's no risk. They are admitting that F-35s could be used to violate international law in Gaza, but they're saying that they're making an exception for this, a carve-out, they call it, because they say that the F-35 programme as a whole is too important for the UK's national security and for international peace and security. So they are admitting directly that they are allowing exports even though they know they could be used in violation of international law. And that, to my mind, is a very damning admission.
Sam Perlo-Freeman, we appreciate you being with us. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for having me.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.